This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. Dr. Gautam Sen joins me from London today to talk about the big thing that everyone in the world is talking about, the tariffs of Donald Trump. Dr. Sen, welcome.
Thank you, Hindol.
I want to begin by talking to you a little bit about how you see this unfold. There were some predictions that yields on US bonds were actually going to go down. In fact, they've gone up. That's, of course, one of the micro issues. But broadly, China is hitting back. There are already, Chinese counter tariffs that are on the table. Memes have started coming out about this. Many countries are now trying to negotiate behind the scenes to get zero tariffs from the US, reciprocal zero tariffs. How do you see all of this pan out? And then, of course, in the second part of this conversation, we'll come to specifically India.
Well, it seems to me this is rather like the last throw of the dice for the United States. It is a bit like how Rome was taken in the 5th century by outsiders. Because a lot of this is puzzling because of the impact it's going to have on the US itself. And broadly speaking, if you really look at the issue for the United States, that they are complaining that their industry has been hollowed out by the unfair trade practices of other countries. Let me first deal with the EU. The average EU tariff against US imports is 1.7%. Now, that's the third largest market in the world. So there is no room for further EU concessions to the United States. They could make it zero, which I think they are offering to do. What else can they do? Nothing. Let's take the country which interests, I'm sure, you and me too, India. India has a trade deficit in merchandise. India has no export surplus in merchandise. Its export surplus is all in IT services. Services in general, near about $385 billion, which actually underwrites the merchandise trade deficit for India. Now, as I'm sure everybody knows, the United States is not going to impose tariff on Indian service exports to the United States. They've also wisely excluded pharmaceuticals because otherwise the cost for US health services would go through the roof. So India has very little to offer. I come back to that because for India, actually, it is more troublesome than some people are saying. This is more troublesome. So the only country which remains is China. Now, China has indeed been paying merry hell for a very long time. But let's remember, all this was made possible by US policy of allowing Chinese entry into the WTO with virtually no effective safeguards. So China did everything that was earlier thought forbidden, from wholesale theft of intellectual property, shamelessly, still going on. And they're so good at it, and they don't apologize. And I kind of understand for a poor country to engage in intellectual theft is perhaps not morally reprehensible, but it's an issue for the people who produce intellectual property. Secondly, they have systematically undervalued the renminbi, right, to stimulate exports. So what the Chinese have done is to use export surpluses to fund their domestic transformation. And one symptom of that is their very high savings rate, which is over 50%, which means domestic consumption does not soak up production and it ends up in export markets. But the US has been extremely culpable in letting all this happen because they had this cockamamie idea that a powerful economy like China will overturn the uh, Soviet impact on the world. Well, that became irrelevant after 1991. But of course, as we know, Joe Biden and his team did not want to end it there. So the only issue for the United States is really China. Now, Beyond that, there are no other countries of significance. If you think about Canada and Mexico, the two other important trading partners of the United States, they are subject to a free trade treaty. The United States signed a free trade treaty in order to outsource production to Mexico to lower their labor costs. For example, motor vehicle parts, in which both India and Mexico are big players. So this was done as a way of making American industry more competitive, say in response to Japanese car production. So, as Kissinger said, uh, being an enemy of the United States is bad, being a friend is worse. So, poor Mexico. They became a supply chain for the United States. They're very heavily dependent. I think 80% of their exports go to the United States. But this was something which was catalyzed by the Free Trade Treaty. Now, Canada is virtually in effect, despite having a different currency of its own, part of the US economy. Complaining about Canada is a bit like saying California has a surplus with the rest of the United States. So this all does not make sense. Now, one underlying issue is the short and medium term, and we do not know how short this short term is, nor how short this medium term is. The disruption is going to prove very costly for everyone, including the United States. Quite clearly, the United States will not, in the best possible of all words, be able to replace the supply chains, which are mainly in China and somewhat in Vietnam, very little India. Look at India. India, despite all its troubles with China since Galwan, has only increased its deficit with China. It went from $100 billion deficit to 120. Now I think it's a little bit lower, 112, because there is nowhere else to go. If you want to buy components at reasonable cost, you cannot compete with Chinese industry. Now, this is a very critical issue, Chinese industry. Yes, they have engaged in all sorts of illegitimate practices. But there is something else to this story, which is very difficult to overcome. First of all, a very large chunk of international trade, I think over 75% intra-firm trade, that is, firms trading within themselves, which is all this issue about supply chain and outsourcing. So many US firms cheerfully outsource to China. Apple, one of the biggest companies in the United States, because it was cheaper to produce there. Now, again, this was good for US corporate profits and therefore good for US corporate taxes. So it was not a one-way street. But there's an interesting problem which arises. A very large volume of international trade in all products now, and it is going to be even larger in time, is in sectors with increasing returns to scale. International trade requires constant returns to scale, which is that the first item produced and the 50,000th item will cost the same. With increasing returns to scale, the larger the volume, the cheaper the average cost of the product. And increasing returns to scale is now growing and growing because a very large chunk of production cost is in R&D. The material cost of even vehicles, I think, is below 40%. That is the physical component of metals, plastics, chrome, I think is 40, maybe even less. The rest is all R&D. Even electronics becomes cheaper as you defray the cost over a larger volume of output. Now, China is very hard to beat in terms of volume production. If you look at the scale of Chinese production of any sector, there are more oversized companies, I think, in a third of Shanghai than the whole of India put together. We have a huge volume disadvantage of scale. And that's partly because of our tax system. We used to reward small scale. So people wouldn't produce large volume, they would just go into a different line of production. So China is king for volume compared to anybody else. Now, how will you square this circle? You can, of course, levy heavy tariffs, but the welfare loss to your economy of producing in your own country, like the United States wants to do, is very high. There are welfare gains in buying cheaply. That is called international specialization. But the international specialization now has a big problem because these are oligopolies. So their location is independent of what is known as factor proportions, capital labor ratios, is independent of that. It is to do with the scale of production and the fact that capital costs on average are the same everywhere. Capital is mobile. So poor country is not going to spend more company. That is, the companies will borrow at the same price as anybody else. So international trade theory has no answer to this. So what do you do? The recommendation of economists going back to the 80s, Brander, Spencer, implicitly in Paul Krugman and others, is that there is a justification for government intervention to help your oligopolies. So you capture the market which otherwise somebody else will. And the Chinese have captured basically in manufacturing, pretty much across the board. Even the Japanese could not compete with them. And now BYD in EVs without tariffs will take the world because they got two things: cost of production, and their range is now hitting 1,000 miles before recharging. So you will not be able to compete. Now that 1,000-mile range is a product of R&D. So you will not be able to compete with China unless you're prepared to sustain significant welfare losses. The only way you square this circle is not through market forces. It is through negotiating between countries. Okay, you have this industry and I have this industry. So your industry will be the cheapest because you will have volume and increase in returns. And in a different sector, I will have this. Not because of market forces, but because we've negotiated that. Rather than you subsidizing and outcompeting me in everything, we will share. So this is the sharing which is implicit in the emerging strategic trade policy. This is very messy, and governments need to negotiate with each other. Implicitly, they already do. Now, in some sectors, the United States is able to compete, like in wide-bodied aircraft, because they dominate the markets. And that's a duopoly between Airbus and Boeing. Now, the Chinese have entered the market. I'm looking at their pricing for their aircraft. It is way lower. The Brazilians are producing phenomenally good, high quality, small carriers. And they are going to take a big chunk of the market. India, I believe, is entering the market with Tata and another company. So this market too is not secure for the United States because they had a comfortable, cushy ride for decades. Now, in a way, they have an advantage in this sector because a lot of the companies in the sector invest a lot, which is funded by the DoD, the Pentagon. So the research costs are publicly underwritten. Now, this public underwriting of research costs and infrastructure costs has a big impact on the pricing of final products produced by the private sector. So if your government has produced good infrastructure, that will be reflected in your cost. Now, what is India trying to do? India has understood this, that their logistics costs are 16%. They want to get it down to 11, lower. China's, I think, is around 9. So that is a benefit to the final pricing of Indian products being sold abroad. So these logistics costs in China are all hugely subsidized from their phenomenal savings rate. All of this feeds into the final pricing of products. How do you compete with that? Is that an unfair trade practice? Not according to the WTO. In some commonsensical way, it is unfair. For example, it's happening in India. Those states which are not giving away free electricity are attacking industry. Punjab is losing because they cross-subsidize between domestic consumers and industrial users. So those people who don't are preferring those states rather than the Punjab. So this is an issue about infrastructure. Wherever is cheaper, and eventually, I think, in my opinion, power will not be a big issue in terms of pricing because, in my view, in the next 20 years, the average unit cost of power will fall because a lot of R&D investment is going on, and we are going to overcome fossil fuels, and it will become cheaper and cheaper. What is the
You know,
problem
there
for
are two
India?
things, Gautam, that there are two things, of course, there. I mean, of course, not just since you mentioned power, the other thing that BYDA does is the Chinese are now, suggesting that they have battery technology which allows a EV to be charged at maybe a fraction of the time that it usually used to take the cars to charge. In fact, it is now comparable to the time that it takes to fill gasoline or petrol or diesel into a car. That of course changes the dynamics completely. The reason I mentioned that is because it's connected to the R&D point. But in fact, Dr. Sen, as long as the Chinese savings rate is what it is, I mean, no country will be able to compete with, number one, its scale, because of course it has lots of people and they're very organized and it has that scale, but also on R&D increasingly, because as long as the Chinese savings rate remains at 50% or more, there is no competing. I mean, the Americans can compete because, of course, they have very large finances, Pentagon funding, and so on and so forth. But at a level, the Chinese savings rate insulates them from any, backlash as far as R&D is concerned.
Well, in the case of BYD, yes, the fact that their vehicles now they're saying can do 1,000 miles between charges. Now that's a big deal. This will cure the critical issue for electric vehicles of range anxiety. That's a very big deal. And secondly, you can't compete with them on price. If you look at the cost of BYD vehicles compared to, say, premium brands, BMW, Mercedes, the difference is 30, 40% plus. And particularly in the smaller vehicle segment, you know, there are a lot of people who can't afford to buy premium brands or even cars produced in Europe, simply can't afford it. It's not that they would choose Chinese, because Chinese cars are lower quality, definitely. They have more glitches. But the cost differential is so great, people will go for it. So without tariffs, companies like BYD will take the world market. Now, this is not going to happen. Of course, electric vehicles will not necessarily be the dominant type of vehicle. There's a lot of other things going on. I believe Toyota is building engines to go on water. India is investing heavily in hydrogen. Many things are happening. So the future is a little bit uncertain. And I believe Tesla has produced a new engine very quietly. Because Tesla at one point was arguing hydrogen is just not feasible. And now I believe they have changed their minds and they're doing lots of things. So leave the car sector aside. China has one very major Achilles heel. We don't know exactly the long and short of it because the data is totally unreliable. I'm reading and looking at very careful analysis of Chinese demographics. And there is a person who does this regularly on a podcast, and she used Chinese official sources and international sources, Russian sources, reliable sources, which are saying China's population is between 300 million and 500 million. China's birth rate has fallen through the floor. This is the Achilles heel. When you have such high servings rates, you squeeze the consumption of your average person. This average person can't afford the house they need, without which you can't get married in China. They're not having children either. They're not married, they're not having children. But this is what is going to be their problem. They may have a high savings rate, but the high savings rate is going to come back and bite them very hard. Even the Communist Party of China, or even the Almighty and Allah, cannot fight off the market. In the end, the market will get you. And that's what's happened to China. Their demographic strategy of one child family is coming back to haunt them. And the most astonishing thing about China today, that in a country where there is a significant shortage of women, women in their 30s can't find partners. Women are saying we cannot find men to marry. And even those who do are saying that we can't afford to have children. Actually, I was very surprised that the cost of child rearing in China is quite high. I thought it would be less than many other, but it is not cheap. So China's demographic crisis is going to be their undoing. Now, what about India? I am very interested in saying something of India. India has one very big blessing. Well, one and a half blessings. One is market size. This market size is not yet real because our market really is not more than 225 million. That is our market to which products of which are major consumer products cannot be really sold to more than 225, 300 million. If this market grew, we have the great benefit of having domestic economy of scale without international trade being so important. Now, India's international trade GDP ratio is about 42, 43. So we are very dependent on international trade, which is why when people say, oh, India is growing slowly, actually, India has done very well considering the global market has slowed down so much. Considering that, India has not done badly at all with 6.5%, 7%. If the global market was robust in the way it was when China was growing, we would have hit 9% for sure. The other thing for India is our population dividend. That population dividend will last us for another 30 plus years. Of course, unemployed population and unskilled population is not any blessing at all. So I think the government is now really woken up to this problem of skilling. And this is a very important thing. And they're doing it now. What is the problem for India? India's problem is that they did not need this grief from Trump right now. We are reaching the height, are trying to reach the height of our Make in India policy. And what it really should have meant is that we will leverage our growing export earnings for domestic transformation the way China did. Not like China. We can't do it like China because China can dictate the savings rate in all sorts of ways, selling land at inflated prices for housing, all of these methods they use. We can't do that, thank God. There are many things we can't do, and which is to our disadvantage, but we didn't have to kill 100 million people to get where we are, which China did. Between the civil war, famine, cultural revolution, approximately 100 million people. So when people say, oh, look, China's done so well, as our favorite opposition leader says, they don't know what they're talking about. India's slow elephant, with all our imperfections, all our policy errors, is way better. And India is a country very difficult to govern. You cannot do important things. For example, agricultural reform would have added 1% per annum to GDP. It's stalled. In a democratic India, small, powerful groups can lay siege to your city and the policy is out of the window. So India is difficult to govern. It's not the fault of the government. Yes, the government always has faults in India, but it's not entirely their doing. So we didn't need this problem from Trump right now. But I think we played it relatively smartly. Because even if they sanction our merchandise exports, it's a tiny percentage of our total exports. Unfortunately, jewelers, clothing, all of that will be hurt, and a few other sectors. I think shoes as well, certain chemicals. But this may be slightly counterbalanced by the fact that other producers have been hit by bigger tariffs, including Bangladesh and Vietnam. So we may be slightly advantaged in, say, clothing. But the bigger problem maybe we don't know about is if the US economy takes a nosedive, which is entirely possible, we have a problem. A 1% rise in the US GDP results in a 1/3 rise in our exports to the United States. So the US grows 1%, our exports to them grow by 1/3. So if they slow down, this will be an issue for us. But as I said, we are not big exporters in merchandise. We will carry on exporting services, IT. Unfortunately, the political economy of oil has changed. We were making good money selling refined petroleum products, and that's no longer the case. But our biggest strength, despite everything, poor Indians are very good at taking punishment. We don't have major social disorder in the way the Chinese will have. They are having. We don't get to hear about it. They had their Tiananmen. They had other major upsets. We tend to kind of absorb everything. So long as our family structures remain intact and we have cross-subjective into family members. And of course, the government has done a lot. Free food for everybody for the first time in history. It was subsidized before Modi came to power, but now it's free. Gas cylinders, Sauchalaya, Pani. We are well protected, but the grief may be that our progress may slow down. Now, what about the United States? They will
Before we
suffer
go to
the
the
chaos.
United States, I have another question to ask. As you venture into talking about the United States, And my question there is, in basic, when we were all learning economics, Dr. Sen, we are all, and people like me who are children really of globalization and grew up at a time when India liberalized, and the first benefits of globalization in a sense flooded into India slowly. Um, my point is that we were all taught that the big way China grew and became successful was by selling large volumes of goods to the United States. For many people in the last 10 years or more, there has been a lot of hope that India could replicate that. It would slowly go up the value chain, for instance, the way it has gone up the value chain in mobile phones. And large volumes of goods could be, like services, goods could be, in a sense, sold to the United States. That window is no longer very clear, isn't it?
Yes, that's more problematic. Of course, we were never going to be able to replicate China's growth path with their volume of exports in the kind of world economy they encountered. That was not going to be easy for us. Many, many years ago, if I may lay claim, I introduced the notion of calibrated globalization. And I noticed Hindu nationalists adopted this term of calibrated globalization. I've never been a fan of unhindered, open ended globalization. Yes, trade specialization is good for all the reasons which we have known from Ricardo to Heckscher to even with strategic trade theory. Specialization is good, and not just for natural products, for manufacturing and other things, and we have been beneficiaries. But you cannot allow this to provoke social disorder, which is why the Indian government will never agree to agricultural free trade. Our tariffs on agriculture are 38%. But the United States has calculated that at 26%, though our average tariff is 17%, between 12 and something, and the average is 17% because lower in some categories. But they said this is our surplus, and they made a calculation on the basis of the surplus. But this is absurd. You cannot have a bilateral balance with individual countries, you see. And as I said in my first post article a few days ago, the United States deficit is entirely to do with China. Having a bilateral surplus with us should have been remedied with adjustment with China. China enjoys an absolutely huge surplus with the United States, as it does with other countries. So they should have negotiated. My recommendation would have been not to do this, as what he has done, but to go sector by sector, to have a kind of strategic trade policy. And then you will find it costly in terms of welfare losses, but at least it will be done over time and the pain will be mitigated. Now, I'm noticing something which surprised me a little. The US tax uh, fiscal spend, GDP fiscal spend actually was 30% in 2020, and it fell to 23.9 in 2024. So it actually the fiscal spend fell, and the average 50-year percentage was 21.1. So they actually did manage to do some budgetary disciplines. But where does the United States spend its money? Its tax revenues. The biggest single one is Social Security, then health, Medicare, health, defense, and of course, last year they were spending more, I think last year, the year before, on servicing their national debt than on defense. I noticed in 2024 it is the same 13% on servicing costs and 13% on defense. Now, when your defense costs are below, your society is in crisis. Now, the other thing which is of importance to the United States, and this is going to cause them trouble, and it's already doing so, 1/4 of US Treasury bills are owned by foreigners. It's not true that they depend entirely on the outside, that is the world. 1/4 is foreigners, and 75% actually is owned by US. 55% by its own citizens, and the rest by the Fed and others. However, if the biggest holders of foreign bonds, which are Japan, China, and the UK, begin to liquidate, and Japan and China especially have been liquidating, it will have an impact at the margin on the cost of borrowing for the US government. And already this 50 basis points announced today shows that people are dumping. And the expectation was actually interest rates may fall, which would have benefited their debt. Their total debt, I think, is 33 trillion, which is about 124% of GDP, which is a high number, but not if you're a reserve currency. If you're a reserve currency, you can afford to carry a bigger debt because other people are using your deficits for their settling their uh, trade transactions. Now, what is happening is now BRICS and others are trying to settle payments in their own currencies. Now, in my view, this will grow, but the BRICS currency and alternative currencies are ultimately the Chinese renminbi and the euro. They are the three players. So, if you give up the US, you have to choose between the other two. Of course, they're going to have it backed by gold. So, all these countries are buying a lot of gold. I think the BRICS countries have bought 600 tons of gold. And I believe huge gold deposits have been found in Orissa and I believe in Punjab, in Pakistan. So maybe it'll be gold back. But the Indians have very wisely refused to say we will be part of BRICS currency because being part of BRICS currency means more dependent on Chinese renminbi, the yuan. And that obviously does not suit us. But the Americans made a catastrophic mistake during the Ukraine war by um, refusing to give, by basically sealing Russian reserves. They gave a fright to everybody else. So
Basically,
everybody
by
else,
weaponizing the SWIFT system.
yeah, and also withholding reserves.
Yeah.
This was a sacred compact. And the Europeans, actually, a lot of the Russian reserves are in Europe. We won't give it back. So if I have big money abroad, I am going to think, when will they be upset with me to halt use of? So India has been discreetly taking its gold back from the Bank of England,
Yes.
bringing it back. So we also don't want too much of our reserves. But we are also stuck. A big chunk of our reserves are in dollar because we've got nowhere to go. So for the Indian government to say we are not going to give up the dollar, it's like saying we have nowhere to go. You see, and that's just fine. I have to say, all said and done, our foreign policy has been very good. We played a complicated game with some mishaps quite well. The menu of choices was very cross-cutting, complicated, contradictory, and we have a superlative external affairs minister. He thinks on his feet and he can think on many levels simultaneously. So he has been impressive, and I think if the EM is impressive, I think your team will deliver, as Hardeep Puri once
The
said
thing
to
that
me.
India is also doing, quite like the Chinese, is trying to find different ways to digitalize their currency and get payments in their currency. India is insisting in many cases where it can now to settle its dues with the rupee, in rupee terms. The Chinese have this whole digital renminbi idea, which they are pushing in different, along with the Belt and Road initiative. We are pushing this entire UPI plus RuPay card. All of these initiatives are essentially to find ways to settle transactions in the local domestic currency, which of course helps, Dr. Sen.
No, this is a very good idea, but it has limitations because if you settle in rupees, the person who ends up with the rupees really has to spend it in your country. And what do we supply? We don't have enough supply for countries to want to buy uh, goods equal to the amount of rupees they've earned, which is the problem the Russians had. We were buying a lot of oil and they were stuck with rupees. And then they decided to invest some of that through a banking innovation in India, to invest some of that. And in a way, it's good because they have judged correctly that India is going to grow and there are good returns to be had. But this is, in the medium to long term. But what that India is doing is good, but you see the way it is working better than it otherwise would. Why are people prepared to take rupees? Is because ultimately India has sufficient reserves to allow encashing of the rupees with dollars. So if India has sufficient dollar reserves, other people will take the rupees and they will know that we will encash it if required. So this is a win-win game for us. The question is how far it can go and how big the impact it will be for India. But we are playing it correctly. I think RBI and Commerce Ministry are doing the right thing. And of course, our digitization on UPI is mind-blowing because though we are still printing more currency than we would like to do, but increasingly the scale of UPI, and I saw you paying for your fuel in your car with your
Fuel, I can pay to literally a roadside vendor for
yes.
like, maybe like a little food or anything, like a samosa on the roadside. I could just pay by UPI.
No, no, I mean, this is just phenomenal. And the digitization is having very wide repercussions because people who are losing so much money transacting, for example, poor Nepalese people were being robbed of up to 5, 6% of any remittances um, from Southeast Asia, UAE, and India. Now, Nepal has adopted UPI, which I kept telling the bankers, you've got to have UPI. India doesn't control the UPI. You can have their autonomous. They have done it because all these people will have to use their smartphone and the money appears in the account of their relative in Nepal. So all of these huge, huge benefits, which applies to Indians too. I'm working as a laborer from UP somewhere else in Bihar or Punjab. I have to send money home. I send it on my smartphone. No, this is a welfare gain for the individual concerned. And printing rupees is expensive. There's a lot of counterfeiting and remote locations. You've got to use helicopters to send the paper currency. All of this is going to be mitigated big time, and it's only going to grow and grow. And the technical architecture, which protects against fraud, uh, interoperability, the whole world is looking with admiration to India. Okay, these issues were there before 2014, but my God, implementation execution is what this government has managed to do, and which seems to be the Prime Minister's greatest strength. Execution and implementation. He seems to do it very well. So great. I think tariffs are not good for India.
So
We will be
I want to
hurt.
talk to, yeah, before you go to tariffs, I also want to couple one point to you, which is talk to me a little bit about what option, as far as the American administration and the Trump administration is concerned, they say this again and again that we had no choice but to take this tariff route because our debt had become unsustainable, and the Chinese interventions were becoming more and more unsustainable. We just had no choice but to take this route. Do you think the Americans could have not taken this route and done something else?
All the choices were bad choices. It was a no-win situation, exactly like the United Kingdom, which is facing a huge economic crisis, fiscal crisis, budgetary crisis. There are no easy options. And in a democracy with elections, um, you cannot inflict too much pain for too long on people. Already in the UK, huge numbers of people are leaving the country, particularly anybody with money. Anybody with £2 million approximately is leaving the country. If they've got liquid assets, they're leaving. It's actually now one of the worst places for departures. I think China, Russia, Britain, I think maybe third. India actually there, but Indians run away to UAE for taxation reasons. Now, whatever the Americans did was bad. But what gain have they got? Their servicing for debt has gone up by 50 basis points, which is $25 billion per annum for their existing debt. So they have not gained anything on that. You see, basically, if I go back to the first thing I said, that last throw of the dice, the United States is in decline for many reasons, one of which is that other centers of power have risen. This is a norm in international relations, in geopolitics. It happens all the time. It happened to Rome. It happened to Persia. It happened to the Ottomans. It happened to the British. And I'm afraid it's America's turn now to face relative decline, which means it does not get its way. If you think about where it was in 1945, it could dictate everything. Even the Soviet Union under Stalin was very keen to have a relationship with the United States, very keen to be included in the Marshall Plan. They were prepared to make concessions because they were on their knees after the war. They lost so much in terms of productive capacity, manpower. The Americans could do whatever they like. But what have they done now? The WTO is dead. It is over. The WTO was the most important international organization after the UN Security Council. Out of the window. The UN is in trouble. I think the US has left the WHO. I think it has left the UNESCO as well because of politics over Israel. So the US is in retreat across the board. The question is how well it will manage its retreat, how well it will manage its alliances. And I'm afraid they are not worried about Europe. What they're saying to Europe is we are going to retrench our spending on your defense and you pick up the tab. That's what they're saying to Europe, which is actually quite a logical and reasonable step because they know there is no Russian threat to Western Europe. This is just nonsense. And they are saying now you manage the defense because you don't need to have it on the scale of the Cold War period. And we are going to
The
concentrate.
Europeans are stepping up. I mean, in recent weeks, there have been increasingly, more vigorous news reports, so to speak, about countries like Germany and others committing more and more budgetary allocations to defense. So, 10 years later, I met this very senior EU official just about 2 weeks ago in Delhi. And, the sense I got was that there is a real palpable sense, especially in Northern Europe, that give us a decade and EU defenses will look very differently.
I'm afraid all this is talk. Yes, they will be obliged to spend more because the US will increasingly retreat. They will reduce their presence to a little bit more than a token. So they will have to increase the defense because they want to keep on. I don't think it's going to go 3% of GDP. The current talk about increasing defense and taking a more aggressive stance against Russia is all to do with telling the Russian, settle on US terms, otherwise we will continue the war. That is what is happening. The French, the Germans, and the British are saying, we will carry on with this war, which you don't want. So you might as well settle on American terms. So this is all a put up job by Trump. You think the British are going to say, we will go into Ukraine without the United States? Excuse me. I mean, you have to live in another planet to believe that. And they have no money anyway. They're scrabbling around for 500 million pounds. So they have got no money to do all this. So they are only saying this because they want the Russians to think, we are going to make sure the war doesn't end. So you settle. Now, for me, there are only two issues involved in this. Will the Russians take Odessa or Kharkiv? They are going to come up to the Dnieper River very close to it because they're never going to trust the Ukrainians and their backers. After paying in blood, they are going to make sure that your artillery is going to be across the river and you will not be able to cross it without us noticing. If you're next to the Russian border, you can cross in many different places, and we have to have a huge army to monitor our entire Ukraine-Russian border. That is why they went to war. So if you across the Dnieper River, we will know and we will feel secure. But this is a very big mistake Gorbachev had made, a very idiotic mistake. So they have paid the price and they are not, and they have said, we no longer trust you. We will never trust you, and nor will they. It's a bit like Nepal signing a peace military treaty with China and Chinese troops appearing in the Terai region of Nepal because they are sovereign, they can do anything. It means that India is indefensible. India will not be able to defend its Bihar-UP border. It will be such a long border. So if they ever hear of this, India will immediately occupy the Terai because they have no choice. They will create a choke point for anybody. So exactly the same holds true for Russia and the Ukraine. So they are not going to spend so much on defense. You see, but this is a very paradoxical situation. After the Second World War, people don't remember, before the war ended, before the peace treaty was signed, before the British arrived in Berlin, Winston Churchill proposed joining with Germany and the captured officers to attack Russia. Google Operation Unthinkable. That they wanted to attack Russia before because this is going to be our new enemy. And before they had even entered Berlin, they were prepared to use all the captured German officers and resume the war against Russia. Do you know why it did not happen? Subhash Bose. Indians don't know. We can take credit for this because they could not fight this war against Russia without Indian troops. Indian troops are the second largest contingent in the Second World War after Russia. the second largest contingent for Indian troops. And Britain could not fight this war against Russia in 1945 because there were no troops from India because Subhash Bose had upset that apple cart. That apple cart was upset by Subhash Bose. That is why it didn't happen. So the other thing which people don't know, the United States had concluded for the Anglo-Saxon people of the world, that is Canada, US, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, and South Africa, by the way, it was Anglo-Saxon by then, would retain their global hegemony only and only if they prevented an alliance between Germany and Russia. They said a paramount goal after the war is to prevent any kind of alliance emerging between Russia and Germany because they will be our main competitor. 3 years ago, I came across a report from the RAND Corporation submitted to the White House. It said, we must stop any kind of Russian-German alliance emerging. I showed this to a top raw official and asked him, do you think this report is forged? He said, no, this report is correct. And Rand denied it, of course. They said, no, it's not our report, but it was their report. And the Nord Stream pipeline was destroyed partly because of that. So the concatenation of interests and conflicts is very complex. Now, India is in a very good position in this. India and Russia will never end up in opposite camps. And both parties know that. And they will reach a more comprehensive settlement. And I believe free trade is looming in the horizon. And we will be in a position to supply to Russia what they were buying from China. We should also definitely improve our ties with the United States because the United States 10 years ago and the United States now are not the same country. It will be a weaker United States with which we will engage. A weaker United States will be much easier to engage with. They will be more dependent on us than we are on them at this moment. So we will have good ties. We have also basically two friends, both of which are important in different ways. One is Israel. Israel and India are really complementary economies. Israel will transfer technology and we will supply them with material goods. Because for Israel, technological advance will be much cheaper than selling to India because the average cost will fall. And they're very good at that. And we already have a big trade in that in any case. And they will buy more from us over time. So it's a terrific match, Israel and India. Vietnam, for geopolitical reasons, is our competitor in clothing, in smartphones. But I think, we should have a considered relationship with them because of our geopolitical positioning on either side of China, that we will have a good relationship. And Vietnam is a good friend to have. They may be much smaller than us, but they are a formidable people. And on dharmic grounds, I'd rather shack up with the Vietnamese than anybody else. I'd rather fight a difficult losing war with Vietnam than win with somebody else. So Vietnam and Russia are good friends, and we are doing extremely well, reaching out to Brazil, Peru, Australia. What do we need now? We need somebody called Narendra Modi to be around after 2029 for one more term. Bhagavan Kare. One more term we need him, or at least to be there in the background. We need stability and growth because our opposition parties, they are irrelevant. They are just fighting for position and goodies in life. They are, neither good nor bad. They are just irrelevant. But we need this man's ferocious capacity to implement. And I'm told by my friends who work for him, my God, he notices what you're doing, he monitors, and if you're not delivering, you're out. We need this for 5 more years beyond this current session of Parliament. And if you can get a bit even further, I will be gone, but I'll be watching from somewhere far away. On that note,
I have
namaste.
one last question to ask you, Dr. Sen. We have gone through a whole gamut of how the world will look like, perhaps in the future. But the interesting thing about the world and technology is that it always changes when you least expect it. The Americans believe that or many Americans believe, certainly many in the Trump administration believe, that all this talk about America in decline is overstated. There will be technological advancement. And I ask you this in a week where we've seen an American lab bring back, after 10,000 years, the dire wolf, who we all only thought we would only see in Game of Thrones and nowhere else ever again. bring back dire wolf cubs back from extinction. Could there be, and I have great faith in American innovation, could there be an innovation leap that the Americans pull out of their hat, which in a sense reverses this decline?
This is a perfectly reasonable point that you make because the answer is we don't know. We don't know, but it is entirely possible that something will happen. You see, it's like, the discovery of fire, transformative moment. The discovery of the stirrup, which changed warfare. Do you know which country invented the stirrup? India. India was the first country to use a stirrup, but it was improved in China. It first came about in India. Big change. It changed global warfare, and that is what made the Mongols impossible to defeat. But they actually even fought on horseback without stirrup. Then electricity. Now we have AI. Who knows what next? And we have reached a point where technological innovation is in the DNA of human society. But if you say the US can do it, so can China. And in 25 years' time, I hope we will be saying, if
So can India.
so can India. We're getting there. We're getting there. Slowly but surely, we're getting there. We need stable government. And for this government to last and to carry on the infrastructure revolution, but they need to also concentrate on the conditions in which political stability can be assured by changing our national narrative. So ordinary Indians understand where we are headed. That they don't vote for free bus passes and throw everything out the window. That they don't vote for 200 units of free electricity and ruin the lives of their grandchildren. So this narrative build-up has been poor in India. So I would pray to the government, please focus on school curriculum much more, and that will take only 1 year to do.
No, Dr. Sen, always a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much. Really wide sweep of history, politics, and of course, innovation covered in this conversation. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Gautam Sen, formerly of the London School of Economics, joining me in conversation to talk about Trump's tariffs and much more. No doubt, as this story develops, we will have other opportunities in the future to talk to Dr. Sen about his opinion about how the story unfolds. Thank you very much, Dr. Sen.
And thank you, Hindol, because you've allowed me to revisit stuff I used to teach 20 years ago. So it brings back memories of this is the kind of stuff that I used to lecture on. So thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure.